Good evening. I hope everybody can hear me back there. Welcome to the Origins Institute public lecture, last in our series for this year. Great to see you all here on another wonderful Canadian evening. Last time you were out here was for the coldest day, I think, in the winter. Before we get started with tonight's great lecture, just a few announcements. Draw your attention to the fact that the Origins 3D Theater will be launching its newest production called Mars, A World on the Edge. This is produced with the director, myself, in collaboration with graduate students who write and produce the show using state-of-the-art 3D materials from around the world. So you don't want to miss this. Look online for the announcement of the launch, which will be sometime in early May. Please tell your friends about this. It'll be really a spectacular show. So for our lecture tonight, it's been a great pleasure to introduce Professor Paul Falkowski from Rutgers University. Paul did his PhD at UBC, my own alma mater, in 1975. Paul is a well-known authority in many areas, including biology of the oceans and the development of early life, rise of oxygen, and many phenomena that are related to early oceans, among many topics of research. Tonight's lecture will focus on, energetics of young life, which is something any physicist or astrophysicist can immediately latch onto. It makes sense in many ways, as we'll find out. So Professor Falkowski, after his PhD, did a postdoc at Rhode Island for a few months, and then was picked up and worked in the very famous the Brookhaven National Laboratories in the United States for 25 years. And then went on to Rutgers University, where he's had many important posts. Currently, as I could get this wrong probably, but as the head of the Environmental Biophysics and Molecular Ecology program at that school. He's a highly sought lecturer. He's given talks all over the world on this. And to boot, he's just launched this book. If you have a copy of this Princeton University press release, this book has just launched and is basically the topic of your topic tonight. So without further ado, Professor Falkowski.
Thank you very much, Ralph. Can you hear me in the back? Yes? Okay. I mean, there's the old joke about somebody in the front says, I can hear him, and somebody in the back says, I can't. The guy in the front says, you can have my seat. Anyway, Life's Engines. This is a book I wrote. It's called Life's Engines. It's a trade book. If you buy it, you can trade it for something for equal or better value. It's a popular book, basically. It's my first attempt to write a book. It took me 3 years to find my voice here because I've written textbooks, and I'm so much of an automaton that when I write a letter when my mother was alive, it would have an introduction, materials and methods, results, and discussion. So escaping from that became very difficult. But basically, the book is about the nanomachines in every living organism that allow life to persist. And I'm going to begin very, 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 very briefly with acknowledging some of my colleagues, especially John Kim, who was a graduate student of mine, whose work I'm going to display, Stefan Sen, who was a postdoc with me, my old and close friend, Vic Nanda, who's a structural biologist. Nathan Yee is born and raised in Calgary and is a very close friend and works, he actually was here just a few weeks ago. So Nathan works on minerals, and then my graduate student, Ben Jelen. So let's begin at the beginning. I'm going to talk about moving of electrons, and I don't want to scare you. So I see there are children in the audience, and this is a G-rated talk. So let's begin at the beginning. Can everybody just, of those of you that are capable, take a breath? That didn't seem too hard, right? Not too hard. Now, believe it or not, you just underwent an oxidation reduction reaction. You just moved hydrogen in your body onto that gas, oxygen, in the atmosphere, and you made another gas, which you don't see, at normal room temperature, which is water vapor. And you all see the water vapor when it's very cold outside, and sometimes you're breathing in the air and you see that puff coming out of your mouth or your nose. That water vapor is not water that is evaporating from your body. That's water vapor that you made by putting the hydrogen onto the oxygen, which allows you to live. Okay, so I'm going to explore a little bit about that in a nice way so that it's not too complicated. All we're looking at basically is how organisms breathe. But, as an aside, there's something important here before I leave this. We all are exchanging gases with our environment. You and I are doing that, right? And I'll give you a clue. Every single living organism on the planet exchanges a gas with its environment. It doesn't have to be oxygen. It can be nitrous oxide. It can be another gas. But in the generation of gases that are exchanged with the environment, we change the surface chemistry of a planet. And that is the basis for how we look for planetary life far, far, far outside of our solar system. We're going to be looking for changes in the gases going forward. So that's the notional idea. Now, this plot. This plot is a very, very famous plot in geochemistry. It was done over a period of 30 years by a guy named Victor Goldschmidt, an Austrian Jew who escaped the Second World War without dying in the Holocaust. And it shows that the most abundant element in our universe is a very simple one. It's hydrogen, hydrogen gas. And that's the gas we just exchanged with the oxygen. And then we find this other very abundant element, which is not very abundant. In fact, it's virtually not present in our atmosphere. It's helium. All the helium that was on Earth has gone off into space. And then we come to these three elements, lithium, beryllium, and boron. And if you're making batteries for Toyotas, you have a problem right now because lithium is a very rare element. So these three elements are destroyed in most stars because they're very fragile. And then we come to carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, bum, 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 bum. We walk over phosphorus and sulfur. So hydrogen, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur. Those 6 elements make all life that we know. The proteins in your body, the nucleic acids in your DNA, the fat in your cells, the carbohydrates that you're metabolizing now, all of those contain oxygen, carbon, sometimes nitrogen, sometimes not, sometimes sulfur, sometimes not, sometimes phosphorus, sometimes not. We call those the big 6. Now, if you want to be cute and you want to remember them, you just put the C in front of the H and you make the word schnapps. Okay, so everybody can remember schnapps. Schnapps, for those of the kids in the audience, schnapps is a little drink that the Germans would have with a little alcohol in it. So those are the big 6. Now let's talk about 5 of them. So there's carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, and sulfur. The game of life is a transfer of electrons amongst those 5. Phosphorus is the one element that doesn't transfer electrons. I'm not going to talk much more about phosphorus. From a geochemical point of view, it's very interesting. From a biological point of view, it is totally boring. So, the carbon, for example, that's in the room right now that is part of the background is carbon dioxide. As far as I know, none of us in this room is able to use the carbon dioxide as a food source. You need to convert the carbon dioxide to a sugar. And a plant does that with photosynthetic reactions. It uses the energy of the sun. So it takes the hydrogen and adds it to the carbon dioxide. It makes a sugar, which you eat in the sandwich you had for lunch, or the muffin you had for breakfast, or the potatoes you had for dinner. And now you're adding the hydrogen back to the oxygen and oxidizing that back to carbon dioxide. Okay? That's what life is all about. It's an electron marketplace. So, life is electric. And I don't mean this as a metaphor. I mean it literally. Virtually everybody in the room who's over about 20 years old has had an EKG. Okay? And when you sit in the doctor's office and they put those electrodes on you, some on your chest, some on your legs, God knows where, and then they turn the machine on, they get electrical pulse. And the electrical pulse is measuring changes in the membrane potential in your heart. So that's a macroscopic manifestation. Now, as far as I know, microbes don't have little microbial hearts. They're not beating away like we are to move that fluid around in our body so we can get the oxygen from the atmosphere. That's what our heart is doing, right? Our heart is moving the fluid around in our body so we can get that oxygen from the atmosphere so we can produce the carbon dioxide so we can generate the energy for life. But the microbes do exactly the same thing. They have a membrane as well, and there's an electrical field between the outside world and the inside of the cell. Every single living cell has that. Every single living cell has that. If it didn't have it, it's dead. Now, the next thing is substrates and products must be cycled. So, you and I are consuming oxygen and generating water and carbon dioxide. As far as I know, we don't have the capability of taking carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and making a sugar. That's what a plant does. So a plant is the inverse of us. So there's a cycle that's paired. Photosynthesis and respiration. Very simple one. It's not for me. Now, let's just do this trivially. So here's the photosynthetic reaction. We're taking, and every fifth grader will learn this. We're taking water and carbon dioxide, making a sugar and oxygen. And aerobic respiration, we're taking the sugar and adding oxygen and making the water and carbon dioxide. The volume of oxygen in Earth's atmosphere today is 21% of the total atmospheric volume. This is not a trace gas. This is the second most abundant gas in the atmosphere after nitrogen. If this reaction were simply to follow this process where we take water and carbon dioxide, made of sugar and oxygen, and then took the sugar, the candy, and respired it, and we'd make this, we would have 0 oxygen accumulating on the planet. So how do we get the oxygen to accumulate? This candy doesn't look like candy, I know. It looks like some complex thing, but it's candy. Okay? Imagine now you have to take the candy and put it on the top shelf in the back of the closet so the children can't get it. So what is the top shelf in the back of the dark closet on Earth? It's rocks. It's rocks. We bury carbon in rocks over billions of years, and that's what allows the production of oxygen. If we didn't have that burial process, you and I would not be here. So in the early Earth's history, we didn't split water. We used hydrogen and iron and hydrogen sulfide and sugars themselves. And this is Ishua. This is a rock that's 3.9 billion years old. And you see a lot of banded iron. And for those of you who are not geologists, but you see this immediately, just looking intuitively, you see these lines, these striations here. They're up like this. They used to be like that. That's because they were sediments at one time in an ocean that's 3.9 billion years ago. We have very good evidence that there was ocean already on this planet 4.2 billion years ago. Before that, we don't know. Today, the source of virtually all of energy on this planet is from this molecule, water. Now, how many of you are students in the university? Okay. I'm going to give you a puzzler, and if I forget, I'll give you the answer at the end. There are 10 to the 19th moles, forget this for those of you who are not interested in this, but there are 10 to the 19th moles of atmospheric volume, of nitrogen and oxygen. If I were to collapse all the oxygen back into the ocean, which is where it came from, to make water, how high would the sea level rise? Okay? Now, the ocean, this is an actual photograph from the moon, is characterizing our planet. And the reason that it's so important is it's the source of salvation, or the amount of stuff that you can dissolve in organisms, and it's a source of energy for life on the planet, as I just described, for oxygen. But that didn't happen for 2.5 billion years of Earth's history. There was no oxygen. This only happened 2.5 billion years ago. Now, let's just put this into a very, very simple frame so you understand how fragile this is. The Earth is approximately 40,000 kilometers in diameter. If I were to take a meter stick and say that's the entire diameter of the Earth, the ocean would be the thickness of about 3 sheets of paper. It is an extremely thin veneer. Extremely thin. It looks big, but it's really, really, really thin. Now, let's just think about how this works for a minute. And these are nano machines, and I want to describe these to you. These are cartoons. I'm going to show you much nicer pictures in a minute. This is the only machine on the planet that splits water. It has a quartet of 4 manganese atoms, and one by one, when a particle of light is absorbed, it oxidizes the water to generate oxygen. Now, you would think that that's such an important reaction that we know exactly how it works. We don't. But the second thing I'm going to tell you, which is fascinating, and I want to describe this to you because I want you to really think about these as machines. These are nano machines. These are far, far, far away from your ability to see them. Even with an electron microscope, they're very hard to see. But watch what happens. Inside this machine here, there's a special chlorophyll molecule. And when a photon comes in, when a particle of light comes in, the chlorophyll loses its electron and goes to an acceptor over here. So we've made a charge separation inside this protein cage that's only a few hundred angstroms across. That's like 100 angstroms across. So I have a minus charge here and a plus charge here. All of a sudden, this protein cage does that. It collapses because the force field is so high. It does that. It does that. Every single photon that comes in, every particle of light, that cage collapses, and it emits a pressure wave, a sound wave. And I can synchronize all these guys with a laser going bang, 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 bang. And all those guys in the audience are clapping exactly at the same rate. And they all give out sound. And I can put a little microphone up there, literally a little microphone, like the kind you would have in a hearing aid. And I can listen to my reaction centers clap. It's called the photoacoustic effect. It was discovered by Alexander Graham Bell. Not for the reaction centers, but that's how originally he was going to plan to use the telephone. So it's a literal machine. Here's another machine. This guy is taking these protons, these are just hydrogens without the electron, and it goes through this complex thing, and it literally is turning. Literally turns. And as it turns, it's generating energy for you and me and every other cell on the planet. These are not static structures. Nature invented a series of literal machines. And they're found in very few organisms. This is a cyanobacteria. The cyanobacteria was engulfed by other cells and creates all these other cells like diatoms and dinoflagellates and all the higher land plants. The machinery in every piece of grass and oak tree out here is exactly the same as the cyanobacteria, exactly the same, that evolved 4 billion years ago, 3.5 billion years ago. Now, this machinery runs a cycle on land and in the ocean. It's exactly the same on land and in the ocean. And it fixes carbon dioxide. It makes food. In geology, we call this the fast carbon cycle. And these are actual satellite images in false color, obviously, but you can see Right now, we're going to green up North America, and then in the wintertime it'll come back, and we're going to not green up North America, and so on. And the point is this, that we fix about 100 gigatons of carbon into organic matter every year, and a very, very, very small amount, 0.001%, goes into the sediments and is buried. And that's the candy that is going into the upper portion of the dark closet. 0.00, so 99.99% of the organic matter that's produced, that candy, somebody finds it and eats it. Now, there's a very funny story here. For 2.5 billion years, the first 2.5 billion years of Earth's history, the first half, there was no oxygen. Everything was living under an anaerobic condition. You and I could not have, there were no animals. There were no animals. First 2.5 billion years. About 2.5 billion years ago, the ball that was on this side went into another bowl. And it created an oxygen-produced world, a world with oxygen. And we never went back. And we cannot go back. So from that point on, we started animal evolution. We started to change the dynamics of the chemistry of the planet. Now, I'm just going to point out that we bury a little bit of organic matter, and it's not in the deep sea. We bury it all along continental margins. And why is that important? Because we extract some of the small fraction of that organic matter that's buried in the oceans becomes oil. And you won't find oil in the middle of the North Atlantic or the South Pacific Ocean. You find oil in the Irish Sea. You'll find oil off the east coast of the United States. You'll find oil off the west coast of North and South America. You'll find a lot of oil, for example, off the west coast of Australia. And of course, there's oil in the Chukchi Sea and so on in the Arctic. Now, before I leave this part of the talk, I want to explain to you that we got the oxygen on the planet. The reason that you and I are here is not just that we buried the organic matter, it's because we also have continents. And this is what's called the Wilson cycle. It's named after Laethuoso Wilson, who was a geophysicist at the University of Toronto, one of the most famous geophysicists of all time. And what he said was this. A craton is what we're standing on. This is the North American craton, in case you didn't know. It's a rock. It doesn't feel like it's very light, but it's light. It's made up with a lot of silica, but it's thick. So all you need to know is this. The Archimedes principle, it floats and it's thick. So if I put a candle underneath here, I start to heat it and heat it and heat it with radioactive heat from the middle of the Earth. I heat it and heat it and heat it. It will fracture. And we'll have two craton bits that start to float away from each other. And it'll go like that for some time. And we'll fill in the middle part here with a rock called basalt, which is oceanic crust. It's thin, but it's dense. It sinks. And after a while, you would think that maybe British Columbia would smack into Japan and China. No such luck. The east coast of North America is going back to France. So what's going to happen is, in about 100 million years, this oceanic cold material will subduct, and it will shave off continental margin onto the land, and will bring all that organic matter up into the rocks on land, and it will look like that. And because you have these rocks, we have oxygen. So life's machines are not operating absent geology. Geology and life go together on Earth. Now, several years ago, this looks horrible, and it won't be on the test, but several years ago, Tom Fenchel and Ed DeLong and we decided, can we do a wiring diagram of the planet? I mean, it's just moving electrons around. And yeah, this is a wiring diagram of Earth. All the metabolisms of microbes and everything else. We are called eukaryotes, you and I. We're organisms that have intracellular organelles like a mitochondria. As one eukaryote talking to others, please don't be offended. We didn't invent anything. Eukaryotes are really, really, really boring. Everything occurs in microbes like bacteria and archaea that you cannot see. And they generate all these electron transfer reactions. Now, let's get to the fun part. Okay. If I pull that diagram apart, it turns out there are only 400 things in the box of parts that move the electrons around. 400 sounds like a lot, but there are about 20 million genes on the planet. Only 400 of them really are important. So that means the other 19,999,000 and so on are kind of like, does the car have 2 mirrors? Is it red? Are the windows big or small? It's looking at body plans rather than how the thing works. And you know that. You walk outside and you see all kinds of cars out here, all kinds of styles. And every year there's a new style coming out. You look under the hood, it's basically the same engine that was created by Daimler and Auto in 1878. An internal combustion engine that runs on gasoline. Now, I think about that wiring diagram as a circuit diagram on a printed circuit board. So there's a power supply, the sun. There are 2 wires. Now let's think about this for a second. We just had a breath of air when we came in, right? We decided we all took a breath. There was oxygen in the room. Was the oxygen in the room created today in the room? No. Was it created outside in Hamilton today? Probably not. There isn't a heck of a lot greening up yet in Canada, unfortunately. Was it created in Canada? Probably not. Not today. So how did it get here? It got here because we have an atmosphere. The atmosphere is a gigantic wire that connects us to distal places that produce oxygen. And so you can go to the Arctic in the middle of the boreal winter where there's no sun shining and it won't shine for at least 5 months, and you can still breathe oxygen because the oxygen is coming to you courtesy of the atmospheric circulation from some distant place, and it may have been produced 1,000 years ago. So that's one wire. The second wire is the ocean. It also is doing exactly the same thing. It's moving gases across the entire globe. So we have 2 wires, the ocean, the atmosphere, 1 power supply, the sun, 400 transistors in the box. We should be able to do the electrical engineering. So let's see, what does the electrical engineer need? So there is one major element which is used in many, many, many of life's transistors, and it's iron. It's used about 70% of life's transistors. When your mother said to you, eat your iron, she meant it for a reason. She didn't know exactly why, probably, but it was because you needed it to move electrons around. The second one is copper, and then you get into these trace elements. I'm not going to bother you with it. So let's take a look at the iron. So this is a close-up of an iron and a sulfur. There are 4 irons and 4 sulfurs, and they're coordinated to a series of amino acids in this protein. It's a very, 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 very old protein. It's called ferredoxin. You have it, I have it, every bacterium has it, every plant has it, virtually every organism on the planet has it. Very simple protein. Now, while you're at it, I'm just going to call attention. You see these little curlicues here? Biologists are not very clever. They call them helices. You see these kind of little arrowy things here? They're sheets. And you see this kind of stuff like that, loopy stuff, we call them loops. That's all you need to know. Loops, sheets, helices, okay? And here's another. This is an organism, a protein that takes the nitrogen in the atmosphere and makes ammonium. Without this, no life would exist on Earth. You see there's a lot of helices in this guy and a lot of loopy things. And it's an iron sulfur cluster again. And we can go on. This is one that contains copper. This one contains manganese. Now, here's where we have smart people, much smarter than I. So I challenged one of my postdoctoral fellows, Ara Carell, to go back and look and see if you could classify the transistors. Instead of finding 400 motifs, there are only 35. 35. There are only 35 transistors that you can go to Radio Shack and buy that make life work. 35. So you have one power supply, 2 wires, 35 transistors. Here's your box of kit. Go make it. Go make something alive. It shouldn't be too hard, but we haven't done it. Now, let's just talk for very, very quickly about, these are the 35. I want to show you the evolution of these guys. And when I talk about the evolution, I mean literally how nature started with a really simple device. Really simple, like that ferredoxin guy. And then built up and built up and built up and built up and made much, much more elaborate proteins until finally they came up to a protein that you and I have, which is the protein that is converting oxygen to water in our bodies. That's one of the last proteins that evolved. A really complicated protein, cytochrome oxidase. But here's what John Kim, one of my graduate students, did. He said, okay, I'm going to go to all these proteins that I have structures for, and it's going to be the 100% loop, 100% sheet, or 100% helix. And I'm just going to put every protein wherever the proportion of those structures is. And the reason that that's cool is, let me just go back here. The reason that's cool is I can draw an arrow from here to there, and there to there, and there to there, and to every other dot here, for every dot to every other dot. And I can measure in the two-dimensional plane of this isosceles triangle a distance. It's called the Euclidean distance. And from that distance, I can tell how far away is that protein structure from where I started now. So, this is the evolution of the proteins that move electrons in life. It has the earliest protein was in an organism that could take H2 gas and convert it to a proton and an electron and use that to fix carbon dioxide to make sugar without light. That's the very, very first metabolism that we know of on the planet from just this structure. And then we walk along, and here is the most recent protein that is using oxygen and converting it to water. So basically, this map is a roadmap from the Daimler Auto engine through all the more complex and more complex stories of automobile industry till we get to something when you open the hood now in most cars, it's so complicated, even though the core of the engine is still a piston that drives it, you have no idea what a carburetor looks like anymore. I mean, these are the fuel injectors and the machinery now that has supercomputers that you have no idea where to go. And neither does your mechanic, by the way. When you bring it into the first thing the mechanic does is plug your car into some diagnostic thing to tell him what is wrong with your car, right? So these are the really complex machines that existed or evolved in very late organisms that came down to you and me. Now, I'm not going to go through this story. The metal distributions in these is very interesting. Most of them contain iron, and some of them contain a little bit of copper and trace metals. But iron is the most abundant of the important elements that make these things work. So that's the top-down approach. That basically said, okay, I gave you a car, open up, look under the hood, and tell me how it was invented. Okay, and if you open up 2 or 3 cars, you can say, well, maybe the internal combustion engine was invented this way. Maybe they had spark plugs. Where did the spark plug come from? You get the idea. So life on Earth is driven by light. We discussed that earlier. That's the power supply. At the top of Earth's atmosphere today, there's a lot of sunshine coming in. But when we go down to the surface of the ocean, this is what you see right at the surface of an ocean today. And you see these big gaps of energy. These are from gases like carbon dioxide primarily and water vapor that are absorbing the solar energy from the top of the atmosphere. But over here, look at this. There's a big gap in these very high energy material, photons that are in the ultraviolet. Now, there's one gas that is protecting us from huge amounts of ultraviolet radiation from the sun. It's ozone. Ozone is produced only in the presence of oxygen. You need molecular oxygen, as far as we know, to generate ozone on a planet. Now, once you generate ozone, its lifetime is relatively short, so you need to continuously generate oxygen to keep the ozone in play. But ozone does a very important thing. It blocks the ultraviolet light from reaching the surface of the planet, which, as most of you realize, ultraviolet light can be very detrimental to DNA. But ultraviolet light has another property. This material in this tube, which is made of quartz, which is visible to ultraviolet light, so ultraviolet light can go through quartz. This material is called siderite. So you don't know what siderite is, maybe, but you'll know what this is. This is chalk. Sometimes you may eat chalk, as in Tums for your tummy, if you have a little bad acid in your stomach. But chalk is a molecule which is very simple. It's got calcium and carbonate. Siderite is exactly like calcium carbonate, except instead of the calcium, it's got iron. It's iron carbonate. Siderite is very, very unstable in the presence of oxygen. So Nathan Yee, the Canadian chemist colleague of mine from Calgary, who was in Calgary, he's now at Rutgers, made siderite with John Kim under absolutely anaerobic conditions. So there's no oxygen in this tube. Now we take the siderite and we expose it to ultraviolet light. Now you don't need magnifying glass in the back of the room to realize that this dot is orange. Do you remember I showed you the picture of the rocks in Ishua from 3.9? You saw orange streaks in them. Orange rocks generally contain iron that is oxidized. Oxidized meaning rust. So what did we do here? The light popped an electron off of the iron. It oxidized the iron just with light. No oxygen, no biology, just light. Now, for those of you who are interested, I think this is the same mechanism by which we made a red planet that's close by. So the carbonate becomes carbon dioxide. It goes off into the atmosphere. Where does the electron go? You pop an electron off of iron, where did it go? It creates hydrogen gas. Now, you see, we have a machine that evolved early that can take hydrogen gas and break it down to an electron and a proton and fix carbon dioxide. That's the hydrogenase. Very early machine. We have a source of the hydrogen gas that is the sun. in the absence of oxygen. So for the first 2.5 billion years of Earth's history, this reaction was an extremely important reaction in generating hydrogen on the surface of the planet, and we had a customer, if you will, for those electrons. Now that's cool. Why? Because we don't actually need photosynthesis yet. That's a really hard reaction. We're using a very simple reaction that has no need for biology to generate the hydrogen, and you have a very simple molecule, a very simple transistor that consumes the hydrogen that makes a sugar. Now, if that isn't a spark of life, I don't know what is. Now, once you start making the sugars, then you're going to have consumers of the sugars because that has a lot of energy, and so on and so forth. Now, I'm going to end this talk in the next 2 minutes with a thought. For the last 15 years or so, I've been working on origins of life, and it's an old man's game, to be honest with you, because it's very, very, very difficult if you're young and you're a graduate student or a postdoc to get a job. I work on origins of life. We need a soil microbiologist. Okay, so it's really hard. So when you get to a certain point in life, you start thinking about what's it all about, and then origins of life becomes something that some of us deal with. I don't know if in my lifetime we will solve the problem of the origins of life. I'm not sure. But I am pretty sure of this. There are an awful lot of extraterrestrial, extrasolar planets that we see. There are planets far outside of our solar system, thousands of them. And we're finding more every year. So it comes back to a very simple question, which I think is as profound as the one of where did we come from? So every 5-year-old, and thankfully every 5-year-old that's capable, asks the question, where did I come from? And that's an origin of life question. But am I alone? Are we alone? So because organisms can change atmospheric chemistry of a planet, we have the capability and certainly the technological understanding of what to measure on extrasolar planets. And I'm going to give you an example of, for example, 2 gases. Obviously, if you found ozone, game's over. We can't imagine ozone without oxygen, and we cannot imagine production of oxygen on a planet without life, at least as of now. It's a self-quenching reaction. Biologically, doesn't go. But that was late. What happens if you came to Earth 3 billion years ago? There was life on Earth. How would you detect it? Well, you'd see methane. Okay, that's not very interesting gas. But if you see methane and nitrous oxide, that's N2O, the kind of gas that your dentist may have given you to laugh with, okay, laughing gas, discovered by Priestley, same guy that discovered oxygen, game's over. Those gases are very far away from each other in terms of what we call redox space. They can only coexist, as far as I know, by life. So we're looking for gases that are far away from equilibrium. And here's an example of how we try to do that today. So we see planets that go in front of their star and then behind the star, and we try to look at the reflectivity. But this is an old, and I put this here for Ralph, this is an artist's rendition of something we know how to do, but we didn't do. And we can do. So these are, in this particular case, 5 satellites that are flying in formation at the gravitational equivalent equal to half the gravity field that's nulled between the moon and Earth. So they're very stable. And the reason you have 3, 4, or 5 of these satellites is they form what is called an interferometer. That means that they can take the background star and cancel out the sunlight from the background star, the light from the background star. Now, why is that important? If you were to look at the dark side of Earth, that's the nighttime view of Earth. Earth, as you know, it's night outside now. You're not freezing to death, right? The reason you're not freezing to death is there are gases in the atmosphere that are trapping the heat. That's the greenhouse gas effect. But the Earth is hot relative to space. So it's glowing like a huge light bulb, but you can't see it because it's in the infrared. Infrared is heat. But to an observer standing out and looking at Earth from far away, you'd see this big glow of a light bulb. Now, remember this? This is the infrared spectrum. And see these gases that are absorbing? So if you're standing outside here, you would see the absorption bands of the gases of Earth. You could see nitrous oxide, you could see methane. They absorb in the infrared. You can see many other gases too, water vapor, carbon dioxide. The point I'm making is that the terrestrial planet finder, I don't know, where are we? Mission, this one, sorry. This kind of mission, which can black out or blank out the light from the star, but look at the dark side of the planet at its night, potentially can inform us very, very precisely of the gas composition of planets that we will never, ever, 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 ever be able to reach with a rocket. And so the best we can do is to start to scan several of those really, really juicy targets of terrestrial planets like Earth that are far enough away from their star that they are not too hot and close enough that they're not too cold, so-called the habitable zone, and to look at the dark side of the planet. And I am sure that even if this is not done in the next 2 years or 3 years or 5 years, it's going to be done in the lifetime of the children that are sitting in the audience. So we may not know where we came from, but we certainly will know at least to first order if we're alone. It may not be intelligent life, but certainly we'll know if there is life. Because remember, every organism has to exchange a gas with its environment. So let me just wrap this up for you. The first half of Earth's history was, I consider, a research and development phase. Okay, these are the guys that were playing with the transistors in the toolbox. Does that work? Yeah, nah. You know, it sort of works, it doesn't work, it works a little bit, okay. Yeah, it fixes nitrogen. All right, send it off, go on, down the stream. And that's what nature did. That's what nature did. It made a nitrogenase, one. The nitrogenase, if you expose it to oxygen, it dies. So nature has figured out, like Bill Gates did for Microsoft programs, the Microsoft solution is to find a patch for every problem that nature created. It didn't just reinvent the programming system, it patched it. So you have 5,000 lines of code to start, you need the patch, you make another 20,000 lines of code. And pretty soon you're Microsoft 2020 and it looks awful, but it works. Okay, so that's nature's R&D. All of these metabolic processes were developed in prokaryotes. That means organisms that don't have internal membranes that are surrounding DNA. So not you and I. You and I were nature's afterthought. There are only about 400 of these core genes, and really only 35 motifs. And all of these sequences are coupled on local and planetary scales. And what do I mean by that? If you were to go to Mars, which has virtually no atmosphere left and no ocean, and John Grotzinger, who was the chief scientist for Curiosity, was to find evidence for one microbe on Mars, that microbe is doomed. It's doomed to extinction. because it can't talk to a microbe across the planet. It has no resupply of energy. There is no cycle that can occur on Mars today. 3 billion years ago, yes, not today. All right. Just so you understand and I understand all of the life on Earth, and I mean this with very, very few exceptions. It's 99.999% of life is driven by the energy of our star. It's not coming from hydrothermal vents. It's not coming from radioactive decay. It's not coming from any other energy source that we have on the planet. It's coming from the sun. Now, I'm going to leave you with a very positive feeling about this. You and I, and all the rest of human beings, in 1 year, we extract 1 million years worth of oil from the earth. In 1 year. That means it took 1 million years to accumulate that oil. We take it out in 1 year. We're a very smart animal. Really, really, really clever. So we use it to light the lights, to heat our houses, to propel us across roads, to propel us across continents or across the oceans, and do other things. In 1 hour, the sun provides the same amount of energy as the entire human species consumes in 1 year. In 1 hour. Now, I'm just going to point out to you that just a few weeks ago, and I do this with all of my honor students in chemistry, I say, look, if you want to change the planet for the better, find a way of splitting water and make hydrogen and oxygen, and just use the hydrogen as an energy carrier. It's an absolutely pollution-free gas. You're just doing exactly what you and I do now, combining the oxygen with the hydrogen, except in the form, now it's chemical hydrogen, and you make a fuel. And if you go to Southern California, God help you, if you go to Southern California, to Irvine, you will see fuel pumps in 6 gas stations where you can actually pump hydrogen into your car, because there are cars that run on hydrogen as fuel cells. I'm going to leave you with this thought. There are about 20 groups in the world that are trying to split water with catalysts. Just one paper I was telling Ralph about earlier today was in Science a couple of weeks ago on February 27th on page 970 in Science magazine, which is a reasonably respectable journal. A Chinese and an Israeli group together used carbon and nitrogen nanodots, no metal, carbon and nitrogen nanodots to split water. Somewhere in the children's lifetime here, we're going to stop needing fossil fuels altogether. You're going to have hydrogen that's going to be available virtually for free from an unlimited supply, water. It's going to go right back to water. It's going to be pollution-free. It's not going to have any CO2 absorption bans. So all we're doing then is mimicking what nature is doing in a way that doesn't require the biological machine anymore. We're just going to make a slimmed-down version of the biological machine. So with that, I just want to inspire the chemists in the audience, the young physicists in the audience, that the machines here are relics of evolution. They're important relics. They haven't changed very much. You and I have exactly the same machines, but we're using them very poorly to help propel us into the future. And so you can use them for inspiration for your own production, in this case, of energy. So thank you very, very much for listening.